Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon from London. We're here today for our FS Club webinar on CCPs, central counterparties. You'll never walk alone. And I'm delighted that we have with us today Richard Metcalfe, who's the head of regulatory affairs at the World Federation of Exchanges. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is a privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars. And I can only do so because of the generosity and tolerance of our sponsors around the world to allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance, and into many corners and places that we would like to examine and explore with you. Today's session is going to follow a format which regular viewers are familiar with. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and let you hear from our expert, Richard. We will then be having a 20-minute question and answer discussion, which I'm hoping that many of you will participate in. A few points of housekeeping. Yes, the slides will be available and they'll be online in the chat area and also on the web page. Secondly, the recording will be going up in approximately 2 working days, so probably late on Wednesday afternoon. And thirdly, to participate in the Q&A, please do use the GoToWebinar question and answer facility. I'm here with you, so I won't be getting WhatsApps or emails or any other sorts of devices. Please use the Q&A facility in GoTo, and I'll be feeding those into a discussion with Richard. Richard will be getting all of the questions, answers, comments, observations that you send along with your emails. If you want to get in touch with him, just pop up, please get in touch with me on X down there in that chat room. And just a final thing, and really by way of introduction from me, we've been hearing now for over a decade with the furore around blockchains and smart ledgers and distributed ledgers that this is surely the end of central counterparties who need them. And yet a decade on, they're as strong as ever and serve a vital role in the wholesale financial markets and the retail. And I think it's going to be interesting today as Richard explores with us what is their role and their future in a world that seems so determined to get rid of them, and yet in which they seem to be doing so well. So Richard, with no further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Michael. I really appreciate the invitation to speak. I won't say too much about the WFE's credentials. Oh, you have a poll as well, of course, we should run, just to get people a little bit warmed up. Is the world a better place for being more collateralized than it was 10 years ago? So if people want to have a quick think about that, it's not a trick question. I'm just really interested to know how people feel about it.
Yeah, so the poll's up there. As ever, over 50% of the audience voted in under 10 seconds. It's a very opinionated group here, Richard. I'll just leave it open for just a few more seconds to get the numbers up. That's great. And I think we can close that now and display the results for you.
Excellent. So, yes. Well, there you go. I am intrigued by the size of the minority that doesn't say yes. I could think of reasons why some people might not say yes, but it's really kind of the underpinning to a lot of what I'll touch on today, particularly about what happened during the markets last spring, which were very, very busy and particularly volatile. The WFE stands for World Federation of Exchanges, but for a long time we've had a very significant CCP membership, and CCPs have become, I would say, probably the key or most debated issue in public policy recently, partly because there's been a lot of thought, or at least a lot of work done, on questions such as recovery and resolution and the extent to which you can borrow or somehow analogize to things like the provisions in banking. Now, as I'm going to lay my cards right on the table right up front and say, you want to be very careful with that sort of thing. So behind my suggested blurb for today was a real concern to try and get at what it is that CCPs have always been, and to warn about some of the dangers of trying to recharacterize them generally, permanently, or even worse, perhaps ad hoc on the fly when things are getting a little bit interesting and tasty. So with those preliminaries in mind, and with a slide at the end which will give you some links to some of the work the WFE's been doing over the past 2 or 3 years, let's just deal with that point that you raised just now, Michael, and a couple of others which I think are threshold points. And there'll be plenty of time for questions. I didn't know how to pitch this because you never quite know with a discussion on CCPs exactly how much detailed expertise your audience is going to have. So I'm prepared for anything and everything on this front. But let's start right at the beginning. Clearing is different from settlement. You could have a bunch of trades that were conducted 3 years ago and they would still require clearing as long as there are credit exposures, particularly credit exposures whose size can move around. And that's most characteristically so in derivatives, but of course it can happen in equities, which is why you see interesting moves like moving to T+1 rather than T+2, because the prices aren't going to move around quite so much in that time frame. So settlement, very interesting topic. DLT, blockchain, all that kind of stuff. Not going to talk about that today. That's not my intention anyway. I could probably handle questions on it. My focus is on credit risk management. But I want to make a really, really, really important distinction here, which is that you're not talking about credit risk management in the sense that you're a bank that built up a portfolio of loans and other exposures, or indeed an investor, an insurance company, or something like that, taking on credit risk. A CCP has been described by some people who have thought long and hard about this, and they work in Chicago, so they're close to some of the source material on all of this. It's more like a commitment mechanism. It's a more useful way, we would argue, to think about it. You're enforcing discipline in a specified user group, and that's quite important because defining who's in that user group is your first line of defense. It's about trying to ensure continuity of positions, although not at any cost. What you're doing is enforcing discipline. You are ensuring that in coordination with the users of the market, the participants, that risk is assessed in an impartial way, and that the discipline works in a good, timely manner and according to clear, equitable rules where people know in advance what's going to happen in certain circumstances. All those things are incredibly important. They boil down to things like, is collateral moving? Is there some backup money in the default fund? Or guarantee fund, as some people call it. But it's not a credit portfolio management business. The CCP doesn't earn money by charging spread over and above a risk-free rate. It charges a fee per transaction that it processes. In the good old days when you could earn money on collateral, it might earn a bit of return on the collateral, although some of that would maybe have been shared with the members as well. The other thing is that the exact sort of nature of a CCP can change in circumstances. In the right, or I should say wrong circumstances, in extremis, there is the potential to mutualize risk. And that's very important, not just as a loss absorption thing, but to keep people focused before you get to that stage and to ensure that the right disciplines are respected and adhered to. And all of this boils down to a kind of polluter pays type principle. So although CCPs back their operations with capital in a vaguely similar way to an investment bank, albeit without running the same positions, and although they have a little bit of skin in the game associated with credit losses, that is purely for signaling alignment. It's not intended as a loss absorption measure. And depending on the circumstances, it may be a bad thing to have that. Now, there's wiggle room in this, and we can talk a bit more about skin if we get into the detail. But forcing a CCP to pick up losses run up by others is not the intention. That's the basic starting premise. The users have to back their risks. So assuming none of that is hugely controversial and the audience hasn't walked off yet, let's move on to the next slide. A few background points. My credentials are that, yes, regulatory affairs at the CCP, at the WFE, I beg your pardon. Our members run getting on for 5 dozen CCPs. All shapes and sizes, all asset classes. variety of jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, you've got a very, very, very large number of clearing members. In others, a smaller number, which makes things a slightly different risk management challenge. Some clear in asset classes that are a bit more volatile than others. It makes for an interesting mix. But all of this is supported by or ensures that variation margin flows back and forth in the day, liquidity staying within the system. Here's an interesting, well, I think it's an interesting little stat though from last spring. I'm not 100% sure of the figures because the way the FSB put the chart into their November publication called the Holistic Review of what happened in March 2020, it's hard to read the numbers, which is an interesting approach for an international standard setting body. But it appears that in a normal run of things, you're seeing around 30 billion go back and forth in the day, and that's staying in the system. As I say, it's a zero-sum game. But it peaked quite sharply, right up to something like 80 billion, and you can do the math on that in percentage-wise, but pretty striking number. There is, of course, a lot of over-collateralization involved, principally in the form of initial margin. That's where the main backup resources reside. As I think most people know, initial margin covers the period after a clearing member has gone bust and before you can close out or auction off their positions. So there's about $1 trillion, and that number stays reasonably stable. It didn't spike in June of last year. The international bodies gather stats on this every quarter. It didn't spike, stayed pretty constant. Same with the extra 100 million of further backup resources that are called the default fund. And that might be quite interesting when we look at some volume numbers in a minute. Variation margin covers mark-to-market changes, sorry, on about 100 trillion in notional terms of exchange traded derivatives, maybe 300 trillion of cleared OTC. Don't have numbers for the non-centrally cleared OTC. But we do know that those markets have added about $1 trillion of collateral since the global financial crisis, in other words, the 2008 fun and games. Those notional numbers aren't much use because they don't really tell you risk. They're not mark-to-market numbers, but just to give you some sort of perspective of what those publicly reported figures translate to in terms of margin that flows. And WFE exchanges will be netting down anything like 99% of the original exposures. That's exposure that's taken out of the market. It's risk exposure that goes. Pretty important network effect, which we'll illustrate in just a second. By way of comparison, CLS does a similar amount of netting down. Netting is a hugely powerful thing. It depends on getting a number of people around a table, metaphorically speaking. So I think that'll probably do in terms of background information. Here's, for those who don't know how it works, here's a little cutesy illustration of netting. In a bilateral world where Mainelli Namlozafinoshap is Metcalfe KFT, I'm not going to give you the full Hungarian for that. And then there's another person trading, and we remunerate each other in fish. Nod there to the aldermanic professor and his writings. So imagine a situation where, as a result of excellent trading in this Metcalfe's head, I'm really good at trading. So I got myself into a position where Mainelli NV owes me 4 fish. I have another set of transactions with a different counterparty based in America called Markle, and I owe that counterparty a couple of fish. And Markle owes Mainelli 3 fish. And if you, Morgan, please roll the slide forward and replace all those obligations with a CCP in the middle, you'll see that the numbers very quickly and beautifully arithmetically show that I'm owed 2 fish on a net basis. Markle and Mainelli each owe 1 fish to the rest of the market. The CCP effectively acts as the conduit on that. And part of the great appeal of the CCP, of course, is that any or all of us have greater certainty that those flows of, in this case, fish, we're saying that this is variation margin, all of those will happen. And if they don't, there will be dire consequences for the person who does not make those payments. Discipline will be imposed on them, and that'll ripple out through pretty much anything else that they do, because you don't withstand You don't go merrily trading in the market if a CCP's called you as being in default. But it does give me an opportunity to stress, and I make no apologies for repeating the point that I made earlier, which is that one of the great things that a CCP can do, as well as ensuring that Mainelli, Metcalfe, or Markle are paying their margin amounts on time, one of the things they can do is check that we're appropriate to be let into that game in the first place. And that kind of gets us back into that whole question of, well, actually, you probably need these trusted third parties. So even if DLT was, technologically relevant here, which it doesn't happen to be, the whole question of trusted third parties is really the issue here. A CCP has an overview of the market. It knows what the gross flows are. It knows who owes what to whom. It knows where there's risk concentrations. If Mainelli owed 50 fish to the rest of the market rather than 4 or 5, that there might be grounds, and there almost certainly would be grounds for more margin being required to reflect the concentration of positions. So these sort of subtle background effects, as well as the reduced operational burden, are also quite important. Now, this is in danger of turning into a lecture, so let's go on to some more policy issues. One of the things about March last year, which has become a kind of test phase, is that counterparty fears did not really manifest themselves. If anything, they were conspicuous by their absence. There was a lot of talk about whether the margin amounts went up by a reasonable amount, but we say that they did. But just pause for a second and look at what John Cunliffe said in November of 2020, that prompt margining avoids a situation in which the perceived stress on one or possibly more than one major player leads to a panic because of the uncertainty about who else might be exposed and how great the exposure is and whether it's adequately protected by margin. And it's that uncertainty as much as that risk. It was, if you go back to what happened during what we can refer to, I guess, as Lehman's, it was the not knowing where the bodies were. It was the not knowing who owed what to whom and what the knock-on effects might be in the market that killed as much as anything else. Now, just switching perspective very, very slightly, there is this question of whether or not the market is sufficiently prepared for the possibility that margin requirements will go up. Speaking very bluntly, we were a little bit surprised that more thought was not being given to that advanced preparation. It became apparent, if you listened into and participated in industry conferences through last year, that there are some firms that in the financial services business are pretty much household names, large sell side, large buy side. They model the potential liquidity impact of margin levels going up. And as the international standard setters are increasingly saying, the likes of CPMI and IOSCO, the question appears to be why not everybody is doing that. Just to illustrate how widespread this issue is, by the way, ISDA put out a statement back in April of last year, noting that banks were having to apply multipliers to their VaR models because of unexpected volatility. And they're saying this isn't the fault of the banks, it's a change in the volatility regime. And that is a good classic risk management answer, because volatility is not constant. And that's the problem you're really wrestling with. But this goes also back to my question at the beginning of the system, which is this beginning of this session, which is to recognize that the system as a whole is collateralized, and that is what drives behavior and I guess, evasive behavior in some cases. But at the same time, putting through things through a CCP takes those risk exposures out of the market, and that reduces the collateral requirements associated with them. So that's a very, very important effect. You had a presenter on before, Michael, a few months ago, who's saying, oh, well, it's all these CCP margin calls. Yeah. And I thought, well, actually, if you compare that with the bilateral world, which is, I think, the fair comparison, then you get a slightly different answer. Certainly the FSB in this November 2020 paper, the holistic review of March 2020, noted that daily demands due to additional initial margin requirements were notably smaller than VM calls. And we in a paper a link to which will appear at the end of this presentation, have noted that procyclicality is a system-wide issue. It's not specific to CCPs. CCPs are one relatively small part of that. And we can move on to the next slide, if you please. If you look at what happened during 2020, I've compared in the first two columns the average exchange-traded derivatives turnover. This is in notionals, but at least it allows a comparison. The daily average, and you see that for both 2018 and 2019, around about the 7 trillion mark. February and March 2020, it ramps up quite considerably. By the time you get to April, drops back down again. Volume surged. That, in very, very large part, is what led to margin calls. And to the extent that there were concentrated volumes, then that would have flowed through in the way I described earlier. So you saw an increase in volumes as well as volatility, leading to higher margin requirements. And I think that illustrates pretty starkly, why you would expect that to happen. And the underlying logic is, well, people use derivatives in a crisis. They're useful. They help you to manage risk, whether you're positioning as an investment position or as a hedge. Don't think there's anything more to say specifically on those charts, so let's move on to the next slide. I want to come back to this point earlier. CCP's role is to help the system. It's not there as a backstop for the system. This is an important distinction. I think it sometimes gets lost a little bit in the resolution and recovery debate, particularly the resolution debate, where you hear people saying, well, what extra resources can we add to the waterfall? Well, it's still a waterfall, and if your premise is that a CCP is out of business, then that's the premise you have to deal with, not can we avoid it. Now, I don't know of any WFE member, and I think they're right, who thinks that it's very likely the CCP would go out of business. There's enough checks and balances in to make it extremely, extremely unlikely. But I do want to stress that what the challenge is that they have to look at. And I'm not talking about non-default losses here, because you can solve for that. You can recapitalize based on non-default losses. What still matters most, and we said this in our paper on non-default losses that we published last year, what still matters most is the possibility of a significant number of larger clearing members going bust. And by definition, the world would have to be in a worse place than it was in Lehman's, because there's so many more protections built into the banking system in terms of bail-in and higher capital. Lehman's portfolio was closed out, his cleared portfolio was closed out quickly and with plenty of money to spare. The IM modeling was right. But the clearing member market, in this instance the US one, is a bit more concentrated than ever. The number of clearing members has not gone up since the crisis, when the clearing obligation was introduced. So that's something that CCPs and their supervisors have to keep an eye on, and it requires a certain amount of judgment. If you have more concentrated positions, then you margin accordingly. It's not an existential threat to CCPs, but it does illustrate the fact that there is a world beyond CCPs whose fortunes could affect potentially the viability of a CCP. It's as simple, but as also profound as that. One of the things that flows from this, and we've said this and we'll go on saying it, is that if you start to look at resolution as well, how do we divide up the spoils from the CCP, you risk influencing behavior earlier in the process, in business as usual, or during an event of default, when the CCP has to work through the so-called waterfall, using up initial margin, default funds, auctioning, that sort of stuff. If you introduce incentives that reduce people's willingness to participate in those things, then you store up trouble. So resolution needs handling extremely carefully. The rules must be set ex ante. Yes, there must be flexibility for supervisors to call the moment when a CCP needs some sort of help, although, as I will stress, it's much more likely to be the banking system that needs the help, because if the banking system goes down, then you're going to have trouble running any CCP. But be very, very careful is what we say about what measures you introduce in resolution, and certainly don't go allowing for the possibility of ad hoc changes on the fly, because then uncertainty will prevail and you're back into that territory that John Cunliffe said we shouldn't. My final slide, please, is to recognize that if the worst does happen, then it will be difficult to run clearing full stop. If the world breaks down such that markets are no longer functioning, it becomes incredibly difficult to model price moves, and it's the modeling of price moves that tell you what sort of initial margin levels are appropriate. So in a situation where one CCP has had to go into resolution, you have to wonder whether that relatively small number of banks may have caused trouble at multiple CCPs and may have made clearing itself very difficult to do. At the same time, because of the netting effects and other benefits from clearing, it's in everybody's interest, not just the CCPs, whether it's for profit or not, it's in everybody's interest to maintain that. You go back to a gross system, and the collateral flows associated with that, you're not in a pretty place. So on that, rather, that warning of potential doom, however unlikely that potential is where we'll let things rest. And I throw myself to the lions of the financial services club.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. It's a deep topic and an important one, and I've got a few comments and questions. If I might just start with one, the slide that you showed on the decline in the number of FCMs, future commission merchants, right?
Yes, sorry for the jargon.
Yeah, is really kind of frightening. We're seeing concentration, aren't we? And is there a sort of an issue here that a CCP is even more effective if there's a diverse market? I mean, if I've only got 3 or 4 major players, I kind of lose some of the advantages of saving on all that fish that you were talking about.
Yeah, let's save the fish. I would say that that's a reasonable question to ask, but I'm not sure that it's beyond the wit of CCP to manage it. I would say that although the network effects will increase as network effects do very dramatically, the more people you add, they start to kick in pretty soon all the same. Mm-hmm. So I think from that point of view, it's not unmanageable. There are a number of jurisdictions which don't have a huge number of clearing members or futures commission merchants, to use the US parlance. I'm not going to mention them by name. We don't do that at this trade association. It's invidious, but it's not hard to find, a handful of jurisdictions where there is not a huge number of clearing members. You just have to be vigilant. Now, and we can draw some comfort, I think, from the fact that the banking system, which is essentially what we're talking about, is in principle sounder than it was 10 years ago. It's slightly alarming when, the likes of the FSB and central banks are saying to banks, "Oh, limit your dividends. We're not sure, you should be handing out money." And yeah, we'll sort of, we're not going to rush to introduce bits of Basel. It makes you wonder exactly how robust the banking system is, and pushes you in the direction of a different policy conclusion, which is market-based finance is not such a bad thing, folks. I would just, so don't get me wrong, I think that a declining number of FCMs is probably not preferable to an increasing number. The fact that the Basel rules have changed a bit may also help. The leverage ratio wasn't working in a particularly good way, and a number of authorities looked at incentives to clear and have tried to fix that. So we may see some improvement over time.
Okay. Just following that a little bit, and on behalf of your members to some degree, I suspect, one could argue that that decline in the number of FCMs might be indicative of cartelization, and that, it's a barrier to entry to not be able to get in, to an appropriate CCP. There are many different types of CCP, obviously. Any comments on that? How do we keep that access open, but on the other hand, as you opened, quite cogently, it's got to be a bit of a members club too.
Yeah, it's a in some ways it's a bit of a piece of string, isn't it? But I think that you are trying to bring in as many appropriate people as possible. I think that, I mean, put it this way, where a lot of the focus has been in the last 2 or 3 years is the extent to which clearing works as well for end users as it does for people right at the core of the system. You're more likely to be in that fish cancelling out fish kind of situation in the interbank world, I would say. Your typical end user, well, I'll be careful what I say here. Some end users are more likely to be directional in their positions. They're likely to be long something pretty systematically. So that doesn't mean they'll never get any netting benefits, but they won't necessarily see the same netting benefits. What they get is enhanced counterparty discipline, which is worth something. But then there are different types of users, of course. You know, some trade in and out and do have offsetting positions, and whereas others are more likely to be structurally long or structurally short. And I think part of the art within a CCP is knowing what the makeup of your market is and setting initial margin levels in a way which reflects the risk but also the potential future risk because of the way people are which way round people are, or the extent to which they may have big chunky positions or may trade in and out and see a lot of stuff net off at the end of each day.
Okay. Reuben Lee, who has written a really good book on, what is an exchange, has a question for you. You said that a CCP is likely to fail when its members, the banks, are failing. If some big banks are failing, as you said, they will be members of multiple CCPs with obligations to all of these CCPs. Does this not mean that in such a situation, the determination of which CCPs survive will essentially be political? Put another way, will U.S. regulators be happy to see failing U.S. banks bail out foreign CCPs?
Yes. Reuben, great question. Thank you. I think it's always been political to some extent. I mean, the world has provision for colleges, and within Europe, there is provision for colleges, which is a good thing. Whether when push comes to shove and you're at the start of the global day and you have to make a decision, whether it's the right thing to wait for other bits of the world to wake up and jointly decide, don't know. Could depend a lot on the circumstances. I would go back to an even more fundamental point. To the extent that a CCP has reached that extreme point where its viability is in question, unless it's idiosyncratic to that CCP, then I think you are going to be facing a much more widespread challenge, which is more to do with whether you are able to rely on counterparties to perform in any capacity, and you are able to robustly model what is likely to happen to prices and therefore to set the initial margin levels correctly. If we're into that, Alice, if we're into that dead parrot territory, then we're into dead parrot territory. And it's not impossible that you have a situation where one CCP is in difficulty and another's not, but if it's to do with things that are very specific to that CCP and can be solved, you're probably going to be in a situation where, okay, you may need to change management, you may need to change part of the systems, things like that. But unwinding all of the obligations within the CCP, that's another matter. And by the way, a bank failing might be owed some money by the CCP, by the rest of the market, wouldn't necessarily owe money to the CCP.
Fair point. Fair point. Sean Turnbull wants, I think, to push a slightly different argument, and I think this is a kind of an extreme position, but it's a good thought experiment. To what extent might, and I think we're talking here just about equities at the moment, to what extent might credit risk be reduced, settlements simplified, and costs reduced if companies were basically the venue for trading their own shares, sort of a mini stock exchange? I don't know, an Apple, a Nokia, where you're buying directly on and off.
Yeah, what if a company tokenized its own shares? I think the supervisor would have something to say about market integrity, price formation, discipline, market abuse. How does this plug into the settlement systems? All a lot of things that you announced and picked up in a paper a few years ago on blockchain. You got to make this all tie up with the rest of how the world works. So I don't see that as being particularly helpful. If you think about it in terms of through the prism of network effects and netting, you're going to be able to concentrate more benefit by having people who are trading, IBM and Shell at the same time, and X owes a certain amount to Y and Y owes a certain amount to X, but in different instruments. So and there's only so far you can go with that, because netting has to be within a kind of distinct asset class for you to be able to model the risks well, which is why you see netting sets embedded in the whole Basel approach to risk. So yeah, it doesn't feel like it's. I would be interested to know in a sort of more formal way how that proposal would really benefit. It doesn't immediately strike me as working, but I would certainly be interested to have a discussion on the side about it.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that within your membership, you've got people running 55 CCPs around the world, and the sums there were pretty impressive. What are the general trends? Are we seeing more internationalization? Are we seeing more asset classes getting lumped together? Are national boundaries hardening? Looking at it from the outside of kind of a Porter Five Forces model, what's going on?
The way I would characterize it, Michael, is that the changes are probably incremental. I mean, there've been interesting things. We put out a paper back in, I think it was 2018, summer 2018, Future of Clearing, which people might want to have a look at. At the time, there was interest in regional clearinghouses, but to Ruben Lee's question, how those work in an environment which is or may very rapidly become political is a very interesting question, to use a good old euphemism. There's been in the past 2 to 3 years, there's been quite a lot of interest specifically in the FX asset class, because very, very little of that is centrally cleared. Very little of it is exchange traded. A lot of the modern derivatives phenomenon started in foreign exchange derivatives, as we all know, but a relatively small proportion of that market is centrally cleared. As bilateral margin requirements kicked in for particularly non-deliverable forwards, you saw more of that market being cleared, and there's quite a lot of competition building up now to try and make more of that cleared. But I would characterize that as essentially an incremental change. There is a lot of interest in trying to make it easier for end users to access, and some have taken up some of that as well. But otherwise, it's kind of it's not an undynamic area, but there's a sort of element of steady as you go. Let's keep an eye on the existing products and how we're helping those to be risk managed.
Okay. A question here from Charles Canona. You started by saying CCPs aren't threatened by distributed ledger technology because of the way that they establish trust and provide oversight and overview. But isn't the real issue the fact that derivative exposure lasts in time, when DLT is more a way to ensure the integrity of a point-in-time transaction?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. This was the distinction I was trying to make when I was saying that, you know, you could have a clearinghouse and apply that process and system to something that was traded, you know, a year ago. In fact, exactly that happened when OTC clearing came in. The traditionally non-centrally cleared OTC market started putting new transactions in, and it started loading old ones. And yes, that's precisely the point. That's why most of the literature on clearing focuses on derivatives, because the length of the exposures and therefore the, you know, chance for things to move around. And if you've got a 30-year swap, what's the, you know, what's the vol on that compared with a 3-year one? And so yeah, that is very much the point, that DLT is about the, yeah, can we make, you know, the delivery versus payment work in a better way?
Now, you've put a lot of food for thought in your slides, and Morgan has kindly posted that for folks there to read and peruse. And I know a lot of it's heavy, but bluntly, if I was a regulator listening in, which is, you know, clearly what lots of trade bodies like to do, is to address the regulator, what's the message you'd really like to get across?
I think it's an if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of message. We're very interested in ensuring that people understand the nature of the non-default loss debate, because people, I think, assume that that's, you know, where a lot more attention needs to be paid, and actually a lot of attention has been paid, which is why we published the paper on it last year. I think there's a big temptation to try and copy and paste from banking or insurance type models in looking at resolution, and I would say be very, very careful doing that. We completely understand that resolution authorities have a really, really difficult task. You know, if they face that situation where they might have to call for resolution, you know, when to call it, what the trigger point is, very, very difficult. And they do need to give themselves some room for maneuver. But the trick will be to not undermine those incentives to participate in auctions, to honour the default waterfall, the, you know, posting of margin, default fund, what have you. And the other further tools that the CCP has, including, you know, assigning contracts back to participants if absolutely necessary. It's kind of like, you know, don't mess with the model unless you're absolutely sure what the consequences are going to be. That's putting it in very sort of crude terms.
Well, Richard, sadly we've come to the end of time, but I think you've gotten a couple of good messages across. I mean, in particular, it is this whole point that, and your fish diagram oddly does show it quite well, you know, it really, really helps the system, but it's not meant to be the backstop or the resolution for it. And I think this has been a sad trend over the last 10 years, is to start with that as a position that shouldn't be. So I'm glad you emphasized that. And it is very clear, you know, some of the numbers you presented, 99% of the coverage and all that, really this is an essential component in a functioning financial system. And let it just run and deal with it. You know, eliminating 99% of the gross or the exposures is impressive numbers. Well, sadly, folks, I just a quick three rounds of thanks, if I may. Firstly, to our sponsors, again, allowing us to explore it's not exactly a murky area, as Richard's shown. There's a lot of data and information, but it is a hard one to get your head around. You have to do your homework. So thank you for exposing some of that to us. Secondly, I'd like to remind the audience that you've been super as always. Thanks for your comments and questions. We do have a particularly interesting event coming forward tomorrow, Augmenting the Augmenters, How the Great Western Metaverse Will Be Built. I don't want to spoil it, but Jeremy Silver from Digital Catapult is going to be looking at what he sees as the most important piece of technology going forward over the next decade. And I have a lot of sympathy with his argument. So turn up and have a look if you want to know the answer. And very finally, of course, Richard, thanks to you. I know when we asked you to do this, you were like, oh, I'm not too sure how I can convey this to not quite an expert audience, but you've done a superb job, and it's been really nice of you to share what it's like there on the front line at WFE, dealing with 55 global CCPs and trying to get some of these complicated messages, but essential messages across. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.